right, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll start now with the first panel of the day. As you know, we have a panel every hour. And each one of these panels are going to discuss an important topic that is relevant for the election, or that has been relevant during the campaign. The first one is for, in many ways, the most timely of them. It's going to be misinformation, disinformation, and social media. So we're very lucky today. We have four experts here that are very well versed in these topics. We have first Dr. Prudence Flowers. She's a senior lecturer in U.S. history at the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences here at Flinders University. Her work focuses on social movement activism, modern conservatism, medicine and public health, and the politics of gender, sexuality, and the body. She has strong interest of hers. A strong interest of hers is abortion and family planning, both as elements of healthcare and as triggers for polarizing social movement formation. So thank you, Prudence, for being here. We also have here to my left Dr. Naser Pourazad. He's an experienced marketing educator and researcher, currently working as a lecturer in marketing in the College of Government, Business and Law here at Flinders University. His research interests include consumer brand relationships, brand memory associations, consumer buying behavior, and marketing via mobile apps. He's currently leading a transdisciplinary research in digital transformation, community and business resilience, and technology adoption. Thank you for being here, Naser. We also have Lachlan Poel, PhD student at Flinders University. His research examines the impact of the digital revolution, particularly disinformation on social media and elections. He's a former intern in the U.S. House of Representatives with our Washington internship program. He also interned at the State Department of the Premier in Cabinet. His academic interests extend to elections and electoral processes all over the world. Thank you, Lachlan, for joining us today. And finally, we have Lucy Bird. She's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Social Influence and Social Change Lab here at Flinders University. Her research interests include how feeling despair about issues like climate change and racial inequality may diminish personal well-being and reduce people's continued engagement in actions to bring about social change. She also focuses on how we can promote progressive social change whilst protecting people's mental health. So thank you, Lucy, for joining us today. So let's start. I think we'll start with Prudence at the end. And then, I'd like to hear this from each one of you. So how has social media, in your opinion, influenced public perception of candidates and political issues? And what role do you think it plays in amplifying misinformation?
Okay. So I'm going to start with the role of social media in the Harris campaign, which is really markedly different to the way that Trump has consistently used social media in the last 3 election cycles. So one of the things that I think has been really interesting for people watching the Harris campaign is the way in which, in what was a very, very short period as the nominee, she immediately moved into quite a sophisticated social media strategy across multiple platforms in a way that we haven't seen any other really presidential candidate utilise platforms to distinguish themselves to voters in the same way. So the example that people kind of pointed at was in the kind of moment in which she was jockeying or positioning herself to be the nominee when Biden stepped down. You had the kind of use of the slime green brat colour on Twitter, and you had her social media presence, which was completely new on TikTok, immediately move into amplifying youth-generated memes. So all of this was really interesting because we're used to seeing either the kind of unchecked social media presence of someone like Trump or a very, very staid approach to social media. And since she's been the nominee, there's been some kind of quite interesting work in how her campaign has approached social media as a key way of energising voters. So one of the things I think that's really notable is that she's had a dedicated, very small team of young people working specifically on her TikTok campaign. They don't do the other platforms. There's only 5 of them. her staff refer to them as feral 25-year-olds, and they're given almost unchecked rein to create memes, create content, and engage in a very online way of communicating, which she's not replicating across other platforms. You know, her campaign team has talked about the fact that they have one message for Facebook, which is really baby boomer central. They have a different message for Twitter, which is kind of more politically oriented. But on TikTok, a lot of the messaging there is very, very engaged with memes and a kind of memification. And I think the default from some commentators was to dismiss this as kind of pointless noise, but actually I think it's a really sophisticated way to drive the youth vote, which is what her team was doing from the outset, was trying to drive youth voter first enrollment and then turnout, because young people in the US consistently vote at the lowest levels of all generations. And so for Kamala, it's been really, really significant that she's focused really heavily, both she and Tim Walz, the VP, on getting the youth vote out, and they've taken TikTok as the means to do that. And one of the things that they point out is that although their follower count is lower on those platforms than someone like Trump, the number of likes that they have is 2 or 3 times higher. So they might have, 5 million followers and almost 3 million likes for the videos that they produce. And the way that they've talked about that is that every like pushes that into other people's feeds and puts other potentially undecided voters getting their eyes on that kind of messaging. And it's a really, really interesting and kind of sophisticated approach to social media that we have not seen in US politics before. In contrast, Trump's approach to social media has been very consistent in some ways. Probably the biggest development this time is the intervention of Elon Musk, which I'm assuming many people are going to talk about. So Trump's always been the Twitter candidate. He was the Twitter candidate in 2016. He's now also, I think it's worth noting, the Truth Social candidate. And he's really running, I think, 2 campaigns. So one on more traditional social media platforms like Twitter, and then on Truth Social, the alt tech platform that he owns and profits from its revenue or its potential revenue, he's running a much more misinformation forward platform, I think, on Truth Social. So there's huge amounts of misinformation happening on Twitter or X, most of which we can actually trace back to Elon Musk, who's been credited with promoting dozens and dozens of false or misinformation claims that have had hundreds of millions of views in the last few months. So Musk is front and center in supporting Trump in a kind of misinformation endeavor on X. And then on Truth Social, Trump is making actually much broader false claims. So just today, for example, he tweeted in the afternoon that there was so much cheating and happening. Sorry, he didn't tweet. On Truth Social, he put out a message saying that there was so much cheating happening in Pennsylvania that the police were arriving. There's no evidence of any of that, but Truth Social doesn't engage in any kind of fact-checking or community notes. And so those kinds of claims he amplifies unchecked in Truth Social, which the New York Times has described as a kind of media conspiracy kind of firestorm. So there's these 2 parallel campaigns running, one of which is very much aimed at generating youth interest and youth engagement, and the other of which is kind of using tropes that we've seen Trump do before, leaning really heavily into misinformation. And I think one of the central differences now is the role of Elon Musk's ownership of X and the kind of wholesale embrace of Trump disinformation strategies.
No, absolutely. And to that, I would always also add RFK Jr., right? Who... It's interesting how he seems to surround himself with people that push disinformation and misinformation over and over. And Naser, from a marketing perspective, what do you think that kind of like gets to?
Yeah, interesting. What I will add is that, by the way, even though you did mention the core research that I have, but the reason that I'm here, because I do research social media and social media influencer particularly. So from that point of view, let me just talk a little bit about misinformation and disinformation at a more sort of fundamental level. We all know how, by the way, probably Prudence, you didn't mention, but I have a feeling Lachlan will sort of dig deeper into this, but we do have to understand the difference between misinformation and disinformation, right? Generally, what I will talk about right now is how social media has evolved into a vehicle for disinformation, but not all misinformation is particularly for that sort of negative and deceitful purpose. So we're talking about disinformation here. What I understand and the way I look at this is through the authenticity lens. I understand that right now, people are finding it more and more difficult to distinguish between authentic behavior and authentic content versus fabricated content, or in a more politically sort of termed, authentic consensus versus fabricated or manufactured consensus. My research really sort of lends itself to how, first and foremost, influencers are using perceived authenticity as a drive for growth, which is an interesting term on its own, right? Perceived authenticity. It's not about the truth or the factfulness of content and behavior. It's about the level or the extent of content and behavior that is perceived authentic or authentic enough by the users. And something that gets that tick of approval that is authentic enough, gets traction, gets sort of picked up by spreaders, and then gets integrated into more mainstream media, and eventually impacts the actual discourse and beliefs and so forth. So what I just said was basically 3 levels how this impact happens, right? There is a seed level by influencers, and I'm not talking about necessarily people who are promoting makeup products or travel or things like that. Influences, people who have influence on social media with a certain number of followers and obviously with a certain level of engagement. So they seed, then you've got spreaders that basically pick up those seeds and spread. Some of those are fabricated spreaders, some are real people. And then you've got integrators that basically pick up things that are authentic enough and then try to spread it. And from then on, some information and content gets into a more sort of mainstream media. So this really shows some serious level of sort of issue on social media, because the way we understand it is that platforms have to do something about this, and because of the sheer number of content and users that exist on social media, they just can't focus on content anymore, unfortunately. So it's all about focus on the behavior. That's why authentic behavior is more moderated rather than authentic content. And the responsibility of authentic content is now basically given to all the users of these platforms, which then again, it's a privilege that not all platforms are giving to their users. So Truth Social is one of those sort of platforms that doesn't give that responsibility or privilege to the users, whereas you've got Meta platforms as well as Twitter/X give that sort of badge or that responsibility. So coming back to platforms, they don't have any other choice to moderate at scale, meaning that try not to focus on the content, try to focus on the behavior of users. So authentic behavior is now a focus for them. So again, that is an issue because disinformation actors are taking advantage of this focus on behavior and trying to create free content using AI and free distribution using social media to really go viral, if you like, right? Which basically means that this inauthentic behavior is now at greater speed, at greater scale, and at greater sophistication. So it's a lot more difficult to just grasp what's happening. And an interesting point from the research sort of perspective is that a lot of what we know about disinformation on social media is technically insights from 3 or 4 years ago. Beyond that, we don't have a whole lot of comprehensive grasp. The reason is that that's when basically Elon Musk bought Twitter, X, and from then on, the access to data and social media data was pretty much stopped. Before that, all that we know about the mechanism of disinformation and how it impacts democratic discourse was basically by researching Twitter data. And that's probably the main source of data that was being used. Yes, Facebook and others were also being used, but not as much. So from then on, we don't really have that access to data anymore because it's not available. It's basically fully blocked. There's a lot of basically blockages and barriers to get data, and most of it is basically pushed back. So what we think we know about how disinformation works is basically from 3-4 years ago. So things have changed. Things have become a lot larger at scales and, like I said, sophistication. So all of this being said is that it just adds to the difficulty or the challenges that we face when it comes to being able to distinguish between authentic content versus inauthentic content, and then authentic behavior versus inauthentic behavior. I'll sort of stop there, but I'm sure I'll sort of again add to other questions later on. But yeah, from the social media as a platform point of view and the way it works, that's where I generally research. And again, it's a shame that all we know is known from only a few years ago, and beyond that, we don't really have recent methodologically robust knowledge and insight.
Absolutely. Elon Musk has completely stopped access to the API data that we all used to have access to, and then Facebook hasn't helped either, right? They also have become more and more stringent with that, so that's an issue for us researchers, absolutely. Now, Lucy, from an individual perspective, right? What does all of that mean? I hear anecdotally, of course, reports from friends, family, colleagues in the United States. People seem to be really upset. Today seems to be a quite upsetting day for many Americans who yes, go out to vote, go home and don't really want to engage. So how does all of this relate to what people feel and how they behave individually?
Yeah, that's right. So the work that I do does look at generally despair, but other emotions about political issues. And I guess even this morning you wake up and Instagram is just full of like doom memes and stuff. Like some of the classics I've already spoken a bit about today is like, what do you mean that NATO's future rests on Erie, Pennsylvania? Like, how is this the future of the world? And people are seeing all of these issues, and obviously with like Instagram and those types of things, predominantly seeing a bit more of a progressive young person's perspective on this election, where a lot of their future seems like it's in the balance based on how these results go. And they're feeling like, yeah, you can vote, but in some places your vote means less because you're in California and yeah, it's going to be Democrat no matter what, pretty much. So people have got that vote, but also feel like no matter what they do, nothing's really going to change. Like, they don't really have control over the situation, but they're also just seeing so much, I guess, unjustified misinformation, and just everything that's going on feels quite, I guess, illegitimate at times. Maybe it's because they care about the climate or women's rights. But then on like the right side, there's now all this doubt about the election integrity again, and seeing the election as illegitimate. And then those people are also feeling like no matter what, like they can't do anything about it. So these types of perceptions of what's going on and the status quo is what we have found leads people to feel this sense of despair. And despair is making people, you feel stressed. People are burnt out. We sort of expected that would mean that people are really just withdrawing, but actually we are finding that it makes people more engaged, because if you're feeling despair, it means like you care about these issues a lot. You care about the election. So they're the ones that generally are actually, they're going to be out there voting. They're the ones out there maybe canvassing for the politician that they support. But it also means that depending on what happens with the election, there could be large protests like we've seen in previous years, whether that goes just the more conventional democratic routes, like we saw with some of the women's marches when Trump was elected in 2016, or the more radical types of collective actions with the Capitol insurrection. So, and a lot of this is really prevalent on social media. People are getting most of their information from that, and also there's that consensus, or people are feeding off of other people's despair as well. And sometimes that can be good because people feel like, oh, other people feel this way too. So you feel like you've got more of a sense of efficacy. There's more that you can do when other people feel and see things the way you do. But at the same time, if you're constantly just seeing like, this is terrible, everything's bad, nothing's going to improve, it's also going to sort of have some pretty negative implications for you as an individual, but also the way that you engage with communities around you and society and democracy.
Absolutely. Now, Lachlan, all of this has been happening. It has happened already, right? It's an ongoing process, and some Americans have finished voting, some are still voting. How does all of this, in your opinion, translate into the behavior that they are showing or have shown today at the polls?
I think it sort of separates itself out into a few different areas. I think there's the policy side of things. So, and that can be often the hardest part when we talk about misinformation as to what is actually true. Because, you know, if you've ever asked an academic a question, they often start with, well, it depends. So the nuance available there is makes it really hard, especially on social media where nuance is lacking. But then there are just some cases where you just have objective facts that are wrong. We saw earlier in the campaign about Haitian immigrants eating, dogs and cats. That is just so fundamentally wrong, and yet became an issue that had to be addressed. You then also have issues around electoral administration, disinformation, trust in election results. We've already seen videos this week of that have been linked back to Russia, where voting machines have been seen as rigged, where you would press the button theoretically to vote for Trump, and it would record a vote for Harris instead. And the intelligence agencies have come out really quickly and gone, no, this is Russian disinformation. And the other one I think is really interesting, particularly on social media, that tends to lean more to the left, is this idea around disinformation and with electoral coalitions. And we've certainly seen this in the past in 2016, where the Russian campaign was very much aimed at creating divisions wherever they existed. And at the time, that was, amongst Bernie Sanders supporters, trying to convince some of them that they should go and vote for Jill Stein. And we're seeing the same things here. We're seeing, particularly on, fraught issues that are quite divisive amongst young people, Israel-Palestine, where we've seen evidence that Russia has intervened in those sorts of things to try and dissuade young people from voting for Harris and instead voting for Stein. So it has sort of that real impact on elections that it can divide coalitions. It can lead to people making misinformed judgments. Now, I don't want to sit here and suggest that every voter who goes and votes is correctly and wholly informed, because we just know that that's not true. But certainly they're basing that some of their voting decisions on information that is just so outlandishly false. But also reducing the trust and faith in election results. We've seen studies that have shown that once you're exposed to narratives of voter fraud, particularly when they come from a candidate involved, that it can be really hard to fact check that and dissuade that later. And that's one of the issues with fact checking is our response. We have that confirmation bias where the first piece of information we obtain is the one that we're more likely to stick with. And so when we get contrary information or that fact checking side of things, we're more likely to dig in. And I think a really good example of that, for those that might have seen, there was somebody talking earlier this week, made a post about Puerto Ricans not being Americans. Despite not being an American state, they are absolutely Americans and got community noted on X. And in return, she just dug in her position, said they're not Americans, and basically accused community notes of harassing her with disinformation. So it leads to some really difficult situations when we're trying to deal with these sorts of issues and ensure, trust and faith in election results. We talked earlier this morning about whether Trump will concede the election if he loses. But we still have plenty of people that have engaged with the idea that Trump did not lose in 2020, and to an extent that's become sort of the price of entry to the modern Republican Party, because the voters have expected that that's what you need to do. So that has impacts on who we elect as politicians. And just to jump onto one thing that was said earlier, the reason we're now focusing on this inauthentic behaviour, which is our bots and all that sort of stuff, is because the difficulty is in fact-checking. It's so hard to fact-check when we're talking about really nuanced claims. And there's just no ability, or at the moment there's no willingness for the platforms to do it. Whether they have the ability is a separate question, but outsourcing to AI has its own problems. But that's the focus on inauthentic behaviour, because they're trying to combat this in some of the only ways they know how, to try and prevent some of this information going out to the public. Unfortunately, with Musk's purchase of Twitter, that seems to have vanished there. Other social media companies do a better job, but I think, considering that their whole ability to make money is based on how much time people spend on these platforms, as was said earlier, if you can get people despairing, if you can get people angry, if you can get people experiencing extreme emotions, they're going to spend more time on the platform, bigger user base, more chance to sell ads, more money into the profit column. So it has impacts all over democracy, but also just elections in general.
Absolutely. Now, 15 years ago, and I shouldn't start like this anymore because it makes me feel old, but 15 years ago, when I was teaching American politics in the US, there was a class that I used to teach where we would talk about political behavior and say, well, people tend to get their information from their preferred source of information, right? And so right-leaning, Republican-leaning people would watch Republican-leaning news outlets. Democratic-leaning people would search for information in those places. Now, has social media heightened that? Is it just sort of like a hyper version of something that was there already, or is it fundamentally different? Maybe we'll start with Prudence, but I'm open to everyone, really.
I think social media functions in a fundamentally different way. So the kind of fragmentation of media is even more extreme. And I think in the way in which many people now get their news from highlights on social media, that's how many people engage with media. Print media is essentially dead, and we all know that. And many people are engaging with media through clips that they find, and then they may go and see kind of broader televised contexts. And I think that has a whole array of consequences beyond just the kind of polarization that happens there, the amplification of polarization. It's long been lamented that no one in the Western world can talk about a kind of common water cooler news experience. So that's a long-standing claim. That's not a new one. But I think if we think about how both candidates have behaved in this election in terms of how they engage with audiences, that also gives us some signs of some of the problems with relying on social media as a way to connect with voters. So on the one hand, Harris has kind of been in some ways praised for the youth voter outreach, and she's, the Democrats, for example, attracted quite a lot of attention for the fact that they invited about 200 influencers to the DNC, which, even though there were, a large number of mainstream media there, the mainstream media were very angry at the special treatment that influencers got. So there was this kind of interesting polarization between influencers and mainstream media. But one of the criticisms people have made about deferring or bringing influencers into these conversations is that influencers, in the way that they engage with news, tend to repeat things. They don't interrogate, they don't necessarily push back. And that's by the nature of their training, by nature of how they've come to be interested in things. So an interview with an influencer, or an influencer focusing on an issue, is not going to approach the issue in the same way that ostensibly a journalist will, who will have certain kinds of codes of ethics and understandings about interrogating the candidate, pushing back. So the deferral to influencers, on the one hand, does allow people to be reached who might otherwise not engage with issues, but it does also further remove any forms of kind of authority or fact-checking from what's going on. And then also, I think it's of note that in the final weeks of the campaign, both Harris and Trump really lent into the podcaster kind of way of reaching people. Trump almost exclusively focusing on the so-called manosphere, so a very, very specific targeted audience that he was trying to reach. Harris had a much broader approach. She's on Howard Stern. She was in negotiations to go on Joe Rogan, as well as more traditional female podcasters. But again, a 3-hour interview with Joe Rogan or a 2-hour interview with Howard Stern is not a robust interview with kind of being fact-checked and held to account. It's a kind of personality tour, if you will. It's a way for people to feel like they can connect with the candidate without necessarily learning that much that's substantial. And I think, again, on the one hand, it reaches perhaps apolitical voters, but this kind of wholesale move into move away from mainstream media is troubling. I will note that Harris did continue to engage with mainstream media, so she did the 60 Minutes interview that Trump refused to do and various other things. But this kind of bringing in of non-traditional news media, I think, is not only going to heighten the polarization, but it's also going to reduce people's kind of encounters with critical engagement with these issues.
Yeah, what I will say is, again, it lends itself to the way social media operates. I remember when I said how influencers are, the core spreader of information. So let me just clarify on that. So if you open your social media, whatever platform these days, if you actually look and think closely of these pages that you're seeing, mostly in short video format these days. People rarely have the patience to read things, so that's why we prefer the short video. That's why YouTube Shorts and Facebook Shorts and Instagram Reels and obviously TikTok is the most preferred one, because that's how we can tolerate. Is that maybe every out of 10, only less than a handful are actually influencers, meaning that real people with real number of followers who have basically progressed into capturing people's attention and engagement and so forth. The rest are what we call spreaders. And what are spreaders is basically influential pages. How these operate is basically they start by pumping out pop culture or entertaining content, from soccer/football all the way to royal family content, everything that cooking content, things that basically grabs people's attention, things that are fun, engaging, entertaining, and harmless, right? So they start with these, start to get traction and follower base, then gradually start squeezing in and just trying to infuse every now and then some pieces of content that are somewhat politically infused. So what you see on socials are more than half are those pages. Again, you may not always see political content, but you see those political content being every now and then infused into those pop, entertaining, fun pages. And that's where we get usually influence in terms of how disinformation wants to ingest this distrust in the dialogue and in the discourse. That's how most of our subconscious beliefs and values are now shaped or changed. And then beyond that, I was reading some statistics last week that we have about proper 200 plus news outlets, and these are alternative news outlets. This is beyond all the known outlets that we know, the actual journalist-based or journalism-based outlets. These are credible, and by credible, I mean certain number of followers, sometimes even with a green sort of validation tick, 200 plus of these. So when a lot of these spreaders share a certain piece of information in a form of either misinformation or deceitful disinformation, then gradually some of these 200 plus news outlets, like alternative news outlets, pick these up and start spreading it amongst millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of their audiences. And that's how our values and our beliefs about what's right and what's wrong, what's truthful and what's non-truthful, what's authentic and what's inauthentic gets either fully shaped if you're young, or fully changed if you're not young, basically. Yeah, that's my comment.
No, thank you. Well, I think we could go on this for hours and hours. Like, this is, of course, a very, very hot topic, and it's not going anywhere. I also know that you guys are not going anywhere. So if we want to continue, we run out of time for the panel, but if we want to continue the conversation on the floor, you're welcome to as well. Thank you very much for being here today. And the next panel is now at 12. Thank you.